evening. I am Rachel Clay. I am the educator at the Historical Society, and I'm so glad you all joined us this evening for our February lecture. I want to thank TechSource for sponsoring our lecture tonight and also for sponsoring our 24-25 lecture series. We're so thankful for their partnership that we get to bring you a variety of lectures throughout the season. Tonight, we are honored to have Dr. Miriam Hiebert with us. Dr. Hiebert is a PhD graduate of the University of Maryland, where she studied materials and science engineering with a focus on glass preservation. She currently uses her specialty in glass preservation as a researcher for the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Tonight, she's going to share with us the fascinating history of uranium cubes, a side interest turned postdoctoral research project that became her book, The Uranium Club, published in 2023. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Miriam Hiebert.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. This is my very first time at Los Alamos, and I've had a wonderful day at the Historical Society and in the archives, and it's just been a great treat to be here today, and especially to be talking about this project in this room. So, I like to start these talks with a little bit of my own personal background and route into this project. Growing up, through most of my education, I really didn't have much exposure to nuclear science or nuclear history. And I really encountered it during my time in graduate school and when I was working at the Maryland University Training Reactor. So this is a small trigger reactor that was built in the 1970s, I believe, in this sort of post-World War II nuclear boom. It is itty-bitty, it is for training and student use only. It produces no power or heat, but it does produce neutrons. So when I was a second-year graduate student, my PhD advisor told me that I would be using the neutron imaging station that we had there to take some data of water incursion into stone. I also took some fun photos of Lego people and flowers. But it was during my time here that I first encountered Tim Koth, who was the reactor director at the time. So my day job is at the Smithsonian. I've always been very interested in the intersection of science and history and art. And Tim figured that out pretty quickly and decided that he was going to let me in on one of his many fascinating little side projects. So he had me come to his office one day, and he started to tell me this story that involved espionage during the Second World War and infighting between scientists and all sorts of drama and intrigue, and I was pretty immediately hooked. And then he went ahead and put an object in my hands, and that was this cube. It is a 5-pound cube of uranium metal. It measures about 2 inches on a side, and I had never seen anything like this before and was pretty instantly hooked. So the cube itself was received as a gift by Tim Koth in August of 2012. He knew what it was pretty much when he saw it, but in case he hadn't, it came with a sort of cryptic, sort of helpful note that says, "Taken from Germany, from the nuclear reactor Hitler tried to build, gift of Ninninger." So we're going to use this note as our guide to sort of go through all of the different pieces of the history of this object and its journey from World War II Germany to College Park, Maryland in 2012. So, and I will mention, this cube is not the cube that is with us today. It is at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, so if you want to see another one, there's one there. But we also have one in the back room today. Okay, so normally when I give this talk, I don't assume that people know the history of nuclear fission. I'm going to guess, given where we are today, that that is not something I have to do quite as much of. So this is the timeline of the development of fission from the interpretation in December of 1938 by Lisa Meitner to the detonation of the bombs in the summer of 1945. So I'm guessing everybody knows most of this story. What I will point out, what I always find so amazing about this, is the amount of time in which this happened. So December 1938 to the summer of 1945 is 6.5 years. That's the length of a PhD. And in that amount of time, they put all of this together, and the world really changed in this really, really condensed period. And everything that I'm going to be talking about for the next however long is going to have taken place within this really short span. Okay. So the first part of the note says taken from Germany, so we'll start there. I'm also guessing everybody in this room is familiar with the Manhattan Project. But just in case, it is the US effort to build the first nuclear weapon. It's headed by General Leslie Groves. It cost $2.3 billion and employed 600,000 people. Does anybody have any guesses of what $2.3 billion would be today? $44 billion, a very good guess. So just to put that huge number into some context, Operation Warp Speed, which was the effort to develop the COVID vaccine during the pandemic, cost about $12 billion. So the scale of the Manhattan Project really had not occurred before or since. There's no match for the size and scope of this massive, massive undertaking. One of the primary reasons that it was so big and so much money was thrown at it and so many people were employed to work on it was because there was an assumption that Germany, which was really the center of the physics world during the early part of the 20th century, would be well on their way to making their own nuclear weapon. Most of the most famous discoveries in physics in the past several decades up to this point had happened in Germany, and they really assumed that the German physicists would have seen the same data that they saw and would have come to the same conclusion that they could build a nuclear weapon, and that likely whoever got there first would be the ones to end the war. So that really motivated the size and scope and scale of the Manhattan Project. But as Germany began to fall, nothing appeared that hinted at any kind of large-scale nuclear program. There's all sorts of little side stories like Operation Peppermint, which was the deployment of Geiger counters onto the beaches during D-Day to see if the Germans had laced the sand with radioactive poisons. They had not. They kept looking for signs of radioactive research or progress all over the place whenever they could in Europe, like testing the water in the Rhine. There was a really complicated series of experiments done on wine to see if they could find trace elements in that. Nothing showed up, so the question began to change. They knew that some work had to have been done in Germany on this topic, and that there must be information and materials and scientists who had been working on it, and they wanted any of that they could gain access to as quickly as possible, largely because they wanted to prevent access of the USSR to those scientists or those materials or whatever they might be able to find. At this point, the Manhattan Project was so far ahead of where Germany clearly was that it wasn't really going to help us, but it could stay out of Russia. So that resulted in the formation of the Alamos mission. This was a top secret military intelligence mission. It was actually the very first military intelligence mission in the United States like this. It was tasked with acquiring information about the German scientific progress in all fields. So there were a lot of people focusing on looking at biological weapon development. There were people who were very interested in their jet engines. The very first scanning electron microscope was developed in Germany during the Second World War and was confiscated by the Alamos mission and now lives at the Smithsonian, which I find very cool. Does anyone know what Alamos means in Greek? Just, you can shout it out. Grove. Yeah, so when General Groves heard that that was what this mission had been named, he was furious, as he was a lot of the time, I think. But he was also a very paranoid man, and he decided that changing it would draw more attention than the name already had. So he left it with the name Alamos. So while all this was going on and they were looking for all sorts of different scientific progress, the real focus of the mission was on trying to figure out how far the Germans had gotten in their own nuclear program and capturing as much information as they possibly could. So there are three major characters that I like to talk about in this part of the story. And the first is John Lansdale. John Lansdale was born in Texas and was living in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a reserve officer and he was a lawyer. And he started to receive these letters that most people in the reserves were receiving, suggesting that they maybe should join the Army full-time as the US military began ramping up for their eventual involvement in the war. Everybody knew it was eventually going to happen, so they wanted to be ready. So John heeded the advice of one of his friends who said, if you say okay early on, you might be able to pick where you live and what kind of work you're doing, which turned out to be the case. He moved to Washington, D.C. He lived in Bethesda. And he was working in military intelligence under General Strong. His first task was processing reports of Nazi and Soviet threats to military assets. So anytime anybody was a little bit suspicious about what was going on, he'd get a report and sort of figure out what to do. He noted pretty quickly that they had a large array of options for figuring out where problems might be, but they really didn't have any steps to take when a threat was identified, and he took it upon himself to take care of that. And he became quite good at his job, and when they needed some help for what I call the Berkeley incident, he was the one who was chosen. So the Berkeley incident occurred when they noted that Lawrence and his colleagues over at Berkeley who were working on the cyclotron that they were building out there were perhaps not being quite as tight-lipped about what they were working on as they should have been. So Lansdale was sent out there to investigate. He made up a civilian persona, he dressed in civilian clothes, he took the train out to Berkeley, and he arrived on campus. And the first thing that he did was walk from the center of campus up to the hill where the cyclotron lab was being built. And he expected at some point he'd run into a gate or like somebody would stop him. Nobody did, the gate was wide open. He walked right into the building and talked to the construction manager who showed him some blueprints of what they were building and explained what was going on. So that wasn't a great start. And then that was even further complicated when he went to lunch that day at the faculty lounge. Lawrence and his physicist friends were the sort of cool kids on campus, and they all sat at the big table in the middle of the dining room. And he was able to identify who these people were, and he sort of schmoozed with them for a while. And within a couple of weeks, he'd been invited to enough dinners and cocktail parties that almost everyone had told him almost everything about what they were doing and why. So he went back to Washington, told this to his higher-ups that this was what was going on, and then he was given the very fun task of returning to Berkeley in his military uniform and showing up at the lunch table and yelling at all of them. So because of his involvement in the Berkeley incident, he was read into the atomic project. So a few months later, General Groves showed up at his door and said, hey, I need some help with the security for the Manhattan Project, and he made sure to tell Lansdale that it was not because he was particularly good at this or qualified, but because he already knew, and he wanted to keep the number of people who knew about this project to a minimum. So it wasn't a compliment, it was just practicality. They actually got along very well, which I think is interesting. Groves didn't get along well with many people, but Lansdale knew how to talk to him. Okay, the second character in this part of the story is Colonel Boris Pash. He's a really confusing person to talk about. He was present at so many major events of the 20th century that it's almost unbelievable. He is definitely the subject of some conspiracy theories that exist on the internet if you start looking. How many are true? Who knows? But he was born in San Francisco, but he was primarily raised in Russia. His father was a high-ranking member of the Russian Orthodox clergy. He fought against the communists during the Russian Revolution, and when the communists took over, he moved back to the United States. He had a lifelong hatred of communists, which led him to enlist in the army when it became clear that World War II was going to make its way to the United States. In 1940, he was born in 1900, so he was 40 years old when he enlisted in the army, making him considerably older than almost everyone that he would have interacted with. He was posted to the Western Defense Command in San Francisco, and he was involved in investigations into USSR espionage, mostly because he spoke fluent Russian. And anybody who's seen the Oppenheimer movie will recall that he was instrumental in the recordings, obtaining the recordings that were then used in the hearings that ended Oppenheimer's career. Largely because he was really sure he hated Oppenheimer and that he shouldn't be allowed to be part of the Manhattan Project, he was selected for the Alamos mission because it was thought that getting him out of the country and away might be the best way to get him off of this particular topic he'd gotten very stuck on. So, the very first Alamos mission occurred not in Germany, but in Italy. It was the first front of the war to open up, so they took advantage of that. They were fairly sure that almost all nuclear research or any research of importance was going to be happening in Germany proper, not Italy, but it gave them a chance to sort of try out how the mission was going to work, and they learned some important lessons with this first period of time. They learned that they needed to be the first people arriving on the scene after the front was cleared. Any amount of time that they waited risked information or individuals being lost, so they really needed to be moving with the front, not behind it. They also learned that they really needed the mission to be led by a scientist, somebody who could understand the data that they were finding in the field in real time and communicate with the people that they were talking to. So that led to the addition of the third member of this group, which was Samuel Houchmet. Samuel Houchmet was born in The Hague. He was Jewish. His claim to physics fame is the discovery of electron spin with George Uhlenbeck in 1925. He was chosen for this role for a number of reasons. He was fluent in Dutch, German, and English, which is helpful when you're in Europe. He was part of the European physics community, and he was particularly close with Bohr and Heisenberg, but he knew most of them very well, which made subsequent interviews and things go a lot smoother. He was not technically involved in the Manhattan Project at the time that he was selected for this, which made him less of a security risk should he be captured. Everybody in the physics community knew what was happening, but nobody knew what was happening unless they were here. So he was working on radar development at MIT when he was tapped for this particular project. I will have everyone's attention drawn to what is on his desk here. This was taken at Brookhaven National Lab in the 50s. I'm not sure if this is the cube that is out there or the other one. He had two. But he definitely liked using them as paperweights and talked about that frequently in the years after the war. Okay, so I think it's important to have a little bit of context about what the physics community was like in the middle of the 20th century. It was a small group of people. They were all fairly close. They had all, at one point, studied with each other or near each other. Everybody was very familiar with each other. So this really fabulous photograph was taken at the University of Michigan at their summer symposium in 1939. This was a couple of months before Germany invaded Poland and World War II started. And you'll notice Samuel Houchmet is on the side with the white, and then Heisenberg standing in the middle directly next to Enrico Fermi. And they are about to lead two totally different nuclear programs on two totally different sides of the war. But here they are, being best buds. Heisenberg was actually staying at Samuel Houchmet's house during this time. So they were really interconnected, and when the war began, it was like a wall dropped between the two sides of the physics community. Everyone in the United States suddenly had absolutely no idea what was happening in Germany, and everyone in Germany had absolutely no idea what was happening in the United States. And they began to just sort of guess about what the other might be working on, which is an important piece of why things went the way they did. So in the United States, they assumed that Germany would be working as hard as they were, and in Germany, they made a different assumption. Okay, so then, the next ALSOS mission, this really wasn't a mission, but they set up a headquarters in London. This was their operation base until they were able to move into France following D-Day. Their first target was Paris, where they were looking for Frédéric Joliot-Curie, who was Marie Curie's son-in-law, who didn't really know a lot about what had been happening in Germany. And when they found him at his lab, he had been busy making small explosives and Molotov cocktails to fight the Germans as they were sort of being kicked out of Paris. So he'd been busy with other things primarily at that point. But they got him out of Paris and got some information from him. They then proceeded to east to Strasbourg. They spent some time in Belgium. Anytime an area opened up that might have information, they went there as quickly as possible and gathered whatever they could. They really figured out what was going on when they were able to access Strasbourg, which is on the border with Germany. They found correspondence there that basically told them everything they needed to know about where the German programs were located, who was in charge of what. So at that point, they were very sure that there wasn't any kind of significant nuclear threat in Germany, but they still needed to find what they could, capture the materials that they could. And so they waited until they were able, until April of 1945, when they were able to access the town of Hegerlach, which is this itty-bitty little town in the Black Forest in Germany. And there they found barrels of heavy water stashed in a mill, a pit inside of a makeshift laboratory that was housed in a cave underneath the castle here. It was their beer cellar or wine cellar before this happened. And then they also dug up 664 cubes of uranium metal in a field sort of outside of town. So that was the sum total of the final nuclear reactor experiment in Germany. at the end of World War II. So there's some other pictures. You can kind of see what the cache of uranium looked like in the box that it was stored in, and then the little mountain that they pulled out. They weigh 5 pounds apiece, so getting them out of the ground and into a truck took a chain of people. They're quite heavy, and I just really like these photos. Okay, so clearly one of the cubes in those piles ended up in the University of Maryland. The question then became how. So there's not a lot of information in the historical record on what happened. We have a couple of mentions. This is from Now It Can Be Told, which was written by General Groves. He says about 1.5 tons of the small metallic uranium cubes were dug up from a plowed field just outside of town. These two were quickly dispatched to Paris. Both heavy water and uranium were then shipped to the United States to be disposed of by the Combined Development Trust. So, okay. They went from Paris to the United States. That's helpful, but not really. I also was able to find this memo at the National Archives. This is from Samuel Houchschmidt to, I believe, Major Furman. It's titled Activity of the Material. And there are a couple of clauses that I thought were interesting. He says, with the help of a Geiger counter borrowed from CWS, a rough measurement was made of the material stored at the depot in Paris. The material was packed in wooden boxes about 1 inch thick. The measurement is not accurate enough to determine whether the material required any special activity as a result of the experiments to which it was exposed, but we know that the type of experiments done makes any appreciable additional activity very unlikely. So it doesn't specifically mention cubes, but to me this very much reads as they had this amount of uranium that they were trying to make sure was safe to ship because they had seen the reactor and were very sure that it hadn't gone critical. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of the story. The next bit is the reactor that Hitler tried to build. So we're going to go back in time again and talk about the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. So I mentioned before that Germany was the center of the physics and science community, really, in the early part of the 20th century. And that is largely due to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is now the Max Planck Society. It was founded in 1911 to promote the natural sciences in Germany. It was subdivided into 29 institutes. There's the KWI for chemistry, founded in 1911, KWI for physics, founded in 1917. There were some weird ones, like the KWI for leather research, cell physiology, and vine breeding. It's also really important for the context of this story and just understanding what was happening in general that the science in Germany, the scientific community, was in no way entirely separate from the politics and racism and anti-Semitism that were happening in Germany at the time. So there was also the KWI for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, which was founded in 1926, which is before Hitler took over, which is alarming, and is responsible for the human experimentation on concentration camp prisoners. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as the scientists were thinking about their roles within the nuclear program in Germany. Some of them, notably Heisenberg, wanted to be able to think about science as something entirely separate from the human concerns that were happening. It clearly was not. Okay, so within this part of the story, there are two fun characters that are good to talk about. Werner Heisenberg, everybody knows. He got his PhD in physics from the University of Munich in 1923. He was born in 1901, so that means he got his PhD when he was 22, which I find extremely annoying. He worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen in 1924 to 25. They developed quantum mechanics, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1932. He was referred to as Germany's golden boy a bunch of physics. James Chadwick, who was part of the British nuclear program, called him the most dangerous possible German in the field because of his brain power. And understanding Heisenberg's a little bit complicated because he had a lot of options to do something different than what he ended up doing during the war. When he was in Michigan in 1939, and for many visits prior to that, as people were sort of seeing what was happening in Germany, his American friends begged him to move to the United States. He could have had a teaching position at any university he wanted in the United States, and his reply was always, "Germany needs me." He really believed in the superiority of German physics and that it needed to be preserved, and his presence in Germany was important to that. He was also just kind of arrogant about how all of the political environment and his intellect might interact. So one of my favorite quotes about him from Samuel Houchschmidt, who knew him quite well, he would say, with little exaggeration and oversimplification, he would say that if Hitler and his Nazis would listen to him for an hour, he would make nice people out of them. So he's a lot. I will also note that he is a theoretician. He had never run an actual experiment in his life until he joined the nuclear program, and that is also important to know. The second major player was Kurt Deibner. He got his PhD from Martin Luther University in 1932. He began working and consulting for the, at that point, government Nazi labs, and was an advisor on nuclear physics to the Reich Ministry of Defense and the Army Ordnance Office. He was referred to as a good Nazi. He was not viewed as part of the sort of academic society by any of the people who were sort of the major players in German physics. They refer to him repeatedly as a second-rater, which the way that they say it makes it seem like that was the worst insult they could possibly come up with. And he was also an experimentalist, and he was honestly closer to what we would maybe consider an engineer now these days. He had a lot of experience building experiments and sort of thinking things through in a practical way. Okay, so the Uranium Club was what they sort of named their nuclear program. It was organized in 1939 by Kurt Deibner. He was tapped to be in charge of this by Erich Schumann, who was the head of weapons research. He issued military orders to all the nuclear scientists he could think of to attend planning sessions in Berlin. And Heisenberg was included in these meetings as an afterthought, I think something Deibner pretty immediately regretted, because everybody loved listening to Heisenberg and what he had to say, and he always clearly had a lot to say. So he immediately sort of dominated the conversations, even though he was not a nuclear physicist. The Weapons Bureau formally took over control of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics, which made everybody mad, and Deibner was made the director, which made everybody even more mad. They began some really early experiments while they were working on uranium supplies and heavy water supplies. They started working on choosing moderator material. They did not use graphite. They didn't understand how the boron poisoning was affecting their results, and they thought it wouldn't be an appropriate moderator, so they ended up choosing heavy water, unlike Chicago Pile 1. Heavy water is expensive and time-consuming to make. It's also a liquid, which is harder to work with. So all in all, that was a complicated choice. They also had some disagreements about the geometry and size of a reactor. So Heisenberg, who was a theoretician, liked the math a lot better if you were to construct a reactor in layers. He liked them either in layers like lasagna or sometimes layers like an onion. But he wanted it to be layers of moderator and uranium in some orientation. Deibner pretty quickly came to the conclusion that the better way to do this would be spheres of uranium interspersed in a moderator material, which is exactly the same conclusion that the scientists in the United States had come to when they began constructing Chicago Pile 1. So he was right. The similarities in all of the dimensions between the reactors he wanted to build and Chicago Pile 1 are quite interesting. It's cool that science works that way and you can come to the same conclusion in two totally different ways. Eventually, they began reactor experiments. They would name the series of experiments after the city that they were conducted in. Heisenberg was ostensibly in charge of the Leipzig University experiments, so the L-series experiments, which ended in a massive fire. And then Deibner was supposed to be in charge of the experiments at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics in Berlin, but that was complicated by Heisenberg's presence. He was constantly being consulted by the other scientists who were working in Berlin and was going back and forth by train all the time. So they ended up building the B-series experiments as layers as well and not the lattice structure that Deibner wanted to do. So they continued sort of building these experiments at a very slow pace, getting enough moderator material, getting enough uranium metal. They had trouble with things catching on fire. Uranium metal in powdered form is pyrophoric, so it'll just spontaneously catch fire, and they had that happen a couple of times. So the progress was fairly slow. In 1943, Deibner was replaced by Heisenberg as the head of the KWIP. At this point, the sort of tide of the war was turning, and it was becoming clear that anything that they were able to produce through these experiments was not going to be significant in determining the course of the war, so the Army lost interest in funding it and controlling it. So it was given back to the sort of traditional first-rater physicists, and Deibner was moved to Gottow, where he took some of his materials and began doing what he had wanted to do all along, which was creating lattice-based experiments. They immediately achieved the highest neutron multiplication of any of the experiments that had been conducted thus far in Germany. He was absolutely right. And by the end of 1944, Heisenberg finally relented and had his plates cut into cubes. So they were all on the same page as far as a lattice-based reactor design. Allied bombing forced the research to leave the Berlin area, so Gotha is just a little bit south of Berlin. And so for one moment, all of the materials that were part of Heisenberg's B7 construction, which was the same as the experiment that was eventually constructed in Hagerlach, so about 600 uranium cubes, and everything that was in Gotha for Deibner's G-series experiments were all consolidated in another tiny town called Statlum. So they had about 1,000 cubes total between the two of them, and they could have taken this moment to be collaborative and build the largest reactor experiment that they had access to see if they could at least achieve the milestone of criticality before the war ended. They did not do that. Heisenberg decided that he didn't want to share, and he took all of his materials and moved it even further south into the tiny town in Hagerlach, where he began constructing B8 in his final experiment. So when I say lab, that's very loose. It is a room that is maybe half the size of this room that is cut into the cliff face. It is now the Atom Keller Museum, so you can see the picture that was taken in 1945 and the picture that I took in 2022. Not much has changed, but instead of a laboratory with the doors blown off, I know, like there's windows in this building. That's pretty much it. Everything else is the same. The town is darling, and I think they enjoy that it looks exactly like it has for 600 years. So when you go into the museum, there's a very nice man who doesn't speak any English who will sell you a ticket, and you can walk around the laboratory. In the center of the lab is the large pit that was filled with heavy water, and they would have lowered the reactor experiment into it. This is what it would have looked like. The individual cubes are held together by aircraft cable, and it's like this really creepy chandelier. And it would have been lowered into the pit, and you know, in an ideal world, it would have achieved criticality. It is important to note that they did not have any kind of control rods or anything built into this reactor experiment. So had it worked, things might have been bad, but it didn't achieve criticality on any level. So one of the questions that's worth asking is how close did the Germans get? And there's a bunch of different ways to interpret this. When they arrived at Hagerlach, Samuel Haudschmidt did some back-of-the-envelope calculations and guessed that they probably needed about 50% more material, both uranium cubes and heavy water, in order to have achieved a critical nuclear reactor. That was confirmed and has been confirmed a couple different times with MCMP modeling of the core. This gets a little bit more complicated when you start to think about the amount of heavy water that was available and the purity of the heavy water. So there's a lot of different ways to ask this question. But the general answer that they would have needed about 50% more uranium cubes to achieve a critical nuclear reactor is particularly interesting when you remember that there were about 400 more cubes that were still back in Statlum at the time. So they might have been able to do it. Okay. So a lot of why the pace of the German program was so slow and so sort of academic in a normal sense is because they had assumed that the Americans would be working in a similar fashion. They guessed that everybody would still be back at their individual universities, working on the individual pieces of this project, wanting to be the first ones to get to the answer and like holding all of their information close to the vest instead of the massive collaboration that was happening here at the time. So there's a really wonderful book that has the recordings that were taken during the time after the scientists were captured in Germany. They were imprisoned. Imprisoned is a very loose word. They had a tennis court and an estate, and there was a grand piano brought in for Heisenberg to play, so they had a nice summer. But they were kept at this estate in England, just outside of London. And they were listened to the whole time. They would have lecture series with each other. They'd argue. They had dinner every night and talked about physics like physicists do. And at one point, there's just so many wonderful moments in these recordings, in these transcripts. At one point, Otto Hahn suggests out loud, just sort of thinking, hey, do you think they might be recording us? To which Heisenberg says, oh no, they're too cute for all that. Of course, they were recording, and one of the most interesting moments that they got on tape was when the scientists heard about the nuclear bombs being dropped. They told Han first when the BBC bulletin went out, because he was sort of instrumental in discovering fission, and he was really affected by this. He was quite upset that his discovery had been used in such a violent way, as many scientists ended up feeling on both sides. But Han said, he went down to dinner and he said, "I don't believe it." And Heisenberg replied, "All I can suggest is that some dilettante in America who knows nothing about it has bluffed them in saying if you drop this, it has the equivalent of 20,000 tons of high explosive, and in reality it doesn't work at all." To which Han replied, "At any rate, Heisenberg, you are just a second-rater, and you might as well pack up." Heisenberg said, "I quite agree." Han said, "They are 50 years further advanced than us." And Heisenberg said, "I don't believe a word of the whole thing." Of course, over the next few days, they started to work out the math together and come to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, this really had happened, and the Americans had successfully created a nuclear weapon. And they then began the task of sort of figuring out how to position themselves within this broader narrative of what had occurred, which there's a lot of debate about that. Okay. So the last part of this story is Gift of Ninninger. This is the most complicated piece of the note to figure out. What's the obvious question? Who's Ninninger? So Googling was complicated in part because the note had a misspelling. It reads, taken from Ninninger, Ninninger. It is not that, it is Nininger. And that is Robert D. Ninninger, who wrote Minerals for Atomic Energy. He was a DC local, and we were able to contact his widow and confirm that she had in fact donated many years before the entirety of his geology collection, including one of these cubes, to somebody at the University of Maryland who had then also retired and forgotten about it, and it was in a drawer, and that's how it ended up with Tim. But how on earth did Ninninger get one of these cubes is the next question. It's just a series of questions to get into how this all fits together. So I spent a lot of time in the National Archives looking through all of the documents that they have, and occasionally you find something really exciting. Archival research is not as fun as science research. It's very boring. It's a lot of reading. But every once in a while, there's just a moment where you see something you haven't seen before, or something clicks together, and those moments are extremely exciting, and you're in a very quiet room, and you have to remain calm. But anyway, this memo talks about property accountability, and the second clause says, Robert T. Ninninger has been appointed accountable property officer for the Murray Hill area effective March 1st, 1945. The cubes were dug up in April of 1945. This is an initial appointment and not a change in property accountable officers. So, okay, cool, that was his job. The next question then is, what's the Murray Hill area? So for that, we're going to start looking at some organizational charts. I think it's important to note that as much of the work that happened here at Los Alamos and at Hanford and at Oak Ridge, so much of the Manhattan Project occurred at much smaller locations around the country. There were many, many universities and corporations and individuals who'd been incorporated into the larger structure of the Manhattan Project. And one of the best summations of that is from Niels Bohr to Edward Teller, saying, I told you it couldn't be done without turning the whole country into a factory, which is really what they did. So there's, when you go to the National Archives, these massive organizational charts that show how everything fit together, and it really was just like a countrywide effort. So there's the Manhattan Engineering District. Under that was the Madison Square area. Madison Square was largely concerned with materials procurement, so getting all of the different things that each of the different areas needed, including uranium. So under that, you can see several other sort of areas. Murray Hill is listed as the name for the Union Mines Development Corporation. So this was a code name that was given. It's an area in Manhattan where all of this was taking place, as they like to use place-specific code words. So, okay. When they began work on developing the nuclear weapons, Groves knew that they needed to not just make one or two, they needed to make the next one and the next one and the next one. You needed to build an arsenal, not just a weapon. He really wanted to be able to corner the global uranium market, which turns out to not be something that is feasible. There's uranium pretty much everywhere. But they really didn't know how much of this there was or what locations it might be in. So he contracted with Union Mines to make a study of all the literature in the world's uranium geology. They got all of the books they could in every language they could, and there was an office in Murray Hill where all of these people were just poring over the literature, trying to find any hints that they might be able to locate different sources of uranium across different areas of the world. This area was led by Paul Guerin, who was a mechanical engineer who worked in the Texas oil industry. He was also quite the character. We won't get into him too much, but there's a lot of fun people in this story. He was aided by a small team of geologists, George Selfridge and George Bain, and of course Robert Nininger. And they began trying to find sources of uranium that they could use and secure for themselves. So most of the uranium that was actively used in the Manhattan Project was from the Congo, the Belgian Congo. It was purchased from Union Minerais, which was the Belgian corporation that owned all of that uranium. A huge store of uranium had been set aside in Brussels in the years before the war, and the CEO of Union Minerais assumed, kind of on a hunch, that this might be important material in the war that was happening. And so he put a bunch of it on a boat and sent it to New York, and he waited for somebody to ask him about it. And eventually, Grubbs was in his office asking if there was any way that they could reopen the mines in the Congo, which had been flooded and were not operational at that point. And he said, no, but I do have all of this uranium ore just sitting in New Jersey. Do you want it? And the answer was yes. However, paying for it was a problem. They needed to be able to spend a lot of money on this material from Belgium without asking Congress for the money, which is a tricky thing to do. They decided, this was a suggestion by John Lansdale because he was a lawyer, that they were going to create something called the Combined Development Trust. This was a trust between the United States, England, and Canada, for some reason, to procure uranium for all of their nuclear programs. It was set up in a way that Congress couldn't see where the money was going, and they were able to purchase that amount of uranium ore for processing, which ended up going into the majority of the Manhattan Project as it occurred during the war. However, they wanted other sources too. So George Bain in particular had a really special knack for finding uranium. He found a huge source in South Africa because he happened to have picked up a rock there when he was traveling several years prior. He also guessed correctly that uranium would be found in monzonite sands in Brazil. They were able to sort of figure out if that was feasible. Colorado was determined to be a source of domestic uranium. The vanadium mines, the tailings of that, had a lot of uranium in it. There was also a lot of uranium coming out of Canada, the Arctic Circle in Ontario that were mined by the El Dorado Mining Company. So there's this group of people who are working in the Manhattan Project looking for sources of uranium around the world. If you are in Paris and you have just been tasked with figuring out where to send a bunch of uranium metal cubes that were dug up in Germany, where would you send them? Probably to the people who are actively looking for sources of uranium. So we're fairly sure that the Murray Hill office would have received the cubes that were shipped from Paris. There's a few reasons we're sure of that, not just a hunch. Most of the cubes that are existent in the world today are directly tied to an individual who has a reason to have them. So this is another organizational chart. This is of the Madison Square area. The area engineer is Colonel Ruhoff in this version in 1943. By 1944, it was Wilbur Kelly, who happens to have been an owner of a cube. You'll also note the Murray Hill is listed with the red arrow. Paul Guerin did not have a cube. His daughter was fairly disappointed that that was the case, but he did not have a cube. But if you look, another really fun name that jumped out at me in the archives was this name under the area Beverly. So you can see Lieutenant D. Duffy. That was a name that I had become familiar with. But I had never heard of Beverly when I saw this. So I went ahead and pulled their organizational chart, which is considerably simpler. It's Lieutenant Duffy and his accountant. And he's the only person from the Manhattan Project who is actively associated with this. But I was able to do some more digging. And the Beverly area was another code name for another corporation. This was Metal Hydrides Incorporated, which was a chemical company founded in 1937 by Peter Alexander. Beverly, Massachusetts. Does anyone know where that is? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's right across the bridge from Salem, which is cool. And it's, the factory was right on the water, right next to the bridge. He had developed a method for converting uranium oxide to uranium metal. He could do this with a bunch of different metals, but it worked for uranium metal. And getting metal from ore is one of the more significant problems that both the German and United States programs faced. And he had developed a way to do this, so he was contracted to produce uranium metal powder for the early reactor experiments. As I mentioned earlier, uranium metal powder is pyrophoric, so there were constantly barrels of burning uranium powder just out on the lawn, which is not great and was kind of a waste of materials. By 1943, they'd come up with a better is relative, it was explosive, but not fire, for producing uranium metal that was moved to St. Louis. And so metal hydrides was converted to reprocessing scrap uranium. So they'd sort of machine uranium parts or whatever, and there'd be little bits of uranium that they wanted to make sure they kept and used, so it would be taken back to Beverly to be made into a format that was helpful. So we believe that the cubes that were confiscated in Paris were most likely sent there, again, not because of a hunch, but because Dick Duffy also had a cube. This one we know of because it was in the back of the sort of hot room storage cabinets at the Maryland University training reactor, where Tim found it when he was poking around one day. He asked his predecessor if he knew about it, and he was like, oh yeah, that's just been there for years. He had been given this cube, or he took this cube off the pile and sort of kept it for himself as things were being reprocessed. He was the second director of the Maryland University training reactor and was a UMD professor. So this second tie to UMD for these objects, which is kind of wild to me. There's something really cool about the sort of geography of how this project worked. So 2 cubes showed up at Maryland through 2 totally different routes. There's also the National Archives that's right off campus in College Park, and the American Institute of Physics and their library and archives are also in College Park. So I could have done all of the research for this project using a bicycle. It's all very located. So this is what we believe remains of the approximately 1,000 cubes of uranium metal that were produced in Germany during World War II. There's sort of 2 groups. In red is everything that was part of the B8 reactor experiment. So there's a few different sort of offshoots. So Frédéric Joliot-Curie got one, which is now in his daughter's apartment in Paris. So Marie Curie's granddaughter uses one as a doorstop. There's one at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History that's in storage in one of their large storage facilities. Wilbur Kelly has one that he then passed on to his daughter, who's now passed it on to Tim Koth, because Tim likes to collect these things. And there's a few others that are cool. On the other side of this, the 400 additional cubes ended up on the black market. I didn't talk about that at all tonight, but there's this really cool series of memos and stories for how they were hunted down and sort of found if there's a few remaining. Most of them probably ended up in the Soviet Union, but some of them were just left behind in Statlam and taken by Alsos mission members. So that included Samuel Houchmit, who took 2, as I mentioned. One belongs to his friend Jonathan Logan, and one is in the front room over there. There's a few others. One is at Harvard University. There's some at Bonn University in Germany. Sally Lansdale lives in Omaha, Nebraska. Hers is on her bookshelf. But really, you can kind of piece together most of this story by looking at who had each of these individual cubes. That was really all of the clues that we were able to follow to piece all of this into one coherent narrative. So I think it's kind of cool. It's kind of a new uranium club of people and institutions that have these objects and get to care for them and talk about them and make sure that people learn from them moving forward. So yeah, this is all in a book. And then some. It's hard to decide what to talk about at any particular moment. There's just so much about this story that I find fascinating and that I had fun learning about. So there's a lot more in the book. And I also just want to sort of note that I am part of a very large community of people. I've been helped by so many people who are all very fascinated by this history, and I've been very fortunate to be taught by them how to do archival research, how all of the nuclear science works, and it's just been wonderful to sort of be part of this community. So, yeah. Are there any questions? That's a good point.
Where did the Nuclear History Museum get their key from?
Oh, Tim.
Oh,
Yeah, he drove it in one shot from Maryland. Yeah.
can you fly with those?
No, absolutely not.
Where did they get the heavy water? And when was the special forces bombing the heavy water plant in Norway and the ship?
So yeah, there were a few different attacks on, so it was Norsk Hydro that made the heavy water that they were using. It was a byproduct that they happened to have noticed of fertilizer processing. So they started making it in earnest to try to provide materials for the German program. And there's several wonderful books on the various attempts to sabotage that plant. And they were largely successful. They blew up the plant on 2 occasions. They blew up a boat that had a lot of the heavy water being transferred on it. So it's likely that had those missions not succeeded or they hadn't been as successful as they were, that there would have been more heavy water than there was in Germany at the end of the war. Based on what we think existed, there probably wasn't enough with a high enough purity to have created a critical nuclear reactor. So they didn't totally know what they were sabotaging, but they knew that it was important, and they did that. They're cool stories.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming this evening. We are going to have a book signing, so if you have a book or if you'd like to purchase a book, you can get those out in the lobby. Miriam will be out there signing for us. We hope you will join us next month in March. You heard Miriam mention her colleague, Dr. Koch, and he's going to be here on March 25th. He's going to be talking about the Enigma machine. So that's going to be another great series. We're very thankful. Again, we're thankful to TechSource for sponsoring so we can bring these amazing speakers and interesting topics to you. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you.
Where's the cue? I did want to say that I never understood the University of Maryland's knowledge. When I first saw that, I thought, no, it's not.
Yeah.
I'll look into it. It's not going to be funny here.
I would. Oh, fun. Yeah, so many people. Is this? We'll have it. Well, we still have stories to share.
I've heard great reviews about this book.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Couldn't be here.
Oh, I hate she couldn't be here. She's out of town. You're seeing that grandbaby.
Yes.
That's important.
That is important.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you.
I thought I would
Thank you so much.
do you want to ride? I would love to ride.